was driving my truck back home from my girlfriend's apartment. There was a pretty big storm going on that night, but I figured since I only lived 10 minutes away, I'd be fine. I would have stayed at her place, but I had to work early the next day, and all my work clothes were at my place. It was dark and the power had gone out. Driving in complete darkness with only your headlights to light your way isn't the most comfortable feeling. The rain was pounding down on my windshield so hard, my wipers couldn't even go fast enough for me to be able to see in front of me. It was like driving blind, but I'd lived in that town my whole life, so I knew where to go. It was like muscle memory on where to turn and how long to drive down a street. I turned onto the road that my house was on, and almost immediately I could tell something wasn't right. It was like my truck was almost floating. I felt wetness at my feet, and the lights began to flicker inside the truck. There was water seeping in. In my headlights, I could see the water getting higher and higher outside my truck. The water came in faster and the truck was sinking into it. The current was taking my truck further in and there was nothing I could do. I took off my seatbelt and tried opening the door on the side and it wouldn't budge. The water was at my knees now and I took deep breaths. My dad always told me not to panic in a scary situation because panicking won't save your life. I had a waterproof flashlight in my glove box and I took that out. I turned it on and looked around for anything I could break the window with. The car had shut off completely by then and the power windows were not an option. I just cleaned the truck out the day before and unfortunately that meant taking out all my tools so I could organize my box. I only had my sweater, the small flashlight, and a pocket knife at my disposal. I called 911 and was greeted by a recorded message telling me every dispatcher was currently handling a call and they'd get to me as soon as possible. And that's when I started to panic. I needed help and it seemed like I wasn't going to get any. The water was now at my belly button when I decided to squat on my seat and try to keep my head above the water as long as possible. The water seemed to be coming in mostly from the driver's side door, so I grabbed my sweater and tried to plug the leak. But it didn't work. But I was desperate and willing to try anything. I was on hold for 7 minutes before I finally got an answer. I told them what was going on, and they were very matter-of-fact when telling me that I wasn't the only person in that type of flooding situation, and that it would be at least 30 minutes before they could get help to me. I kept telling him that I felt like I didn't have 30 minutes, but he told me there was nothing else he could do. I asked if he'd stay on the phone with me, but he said because of the demand for emergency services during the storm, they needed as many dispatchers as they could get, and if the situation got worse, I could call back again. I hung up with the dispatcher, and already knew that that wouldn't be an option. If the situation did get worse, I wouldn't have 7 minutes to wait on and hold to tell someone about it. I'd be dead. The water kept rising and my heartbeat quickened. I was scared and confused why I wasn't getting any help and my mom and dad both weren't answering their phones. I opened the voice recorder app and started recording my goodbyes to my family. I wasn't sure if they'd get them, but it was better than nothing and somehow easing my nerves. It was like I was talking to them without literally talking to them. But something about it was kind of therapeutic in the moment. Only 10 minutes after I hung up with 911, the water had begun to reach my chest. I was certain that I was going to die when only 1 foot of the car had space for air. I started praying to God to please not let me die, but if I did, to let me go to heaven. I hadn't been very religious in my adult life until that exact moment, but I guess that's how it goes usually. You realize your true belief in God when you really need him. But anyways, another 5 minutes went by and it was at my neck. I had my cheek pressed against the roof and I couldn't help but cry. I was beginning to lose hope. No one was coming for me. I was only able to breathe through my nose when I heard the sound of an engine nearby. I didn't think that they'd even notice my truck, so I started screaming and flashing my light to get their attention. And I felt this sense of relief when I heard this boat pull up next to my truck. I shone my flashlight and saw someone jump into the water next to my driver's side window. He had this window breaker with him and it shattered on the first try. He reached in the truck, grabbed onto my shirt. I took a deep breath as he pulled me out of the truck through the window. They got me on board the boat and I began just thanking them profusely for saving my life as I took deep breaths of the air I thought only minutes before I was about to run out of. They wrapped an emergency blanket around me, and we were off. We helped a few more people out of the cars before reaching an area where police and firemen were waiting. I was taken to a hospital, but I didn't have anything medically wrong with me, thank God. Thankfully, no one did die during that storm, although I know that I came very close to being the one fatality. I felt so failed by my city's emergency services, and I found out that night that the people that saved me weren't even officers. They were just good Samaritans that heard people were in trouble and knew that they had to help. For months after the incident, I had nightmares about drowning. Even now, I get scared to drive during a storm or even go out on a boat. Deep water terrifies me. I've gone to therapy a few times, but it never seemed to help, so I just stopped. I just hope there's a day, hopefully soon, where I can fully move on from what happened and not let it haunt me like it does right now. I'm glad I survived, and I'm glad the people in my community stepped up when law enforcement wouldn't. I should have never been left there to die, and that's exactly what they ended up doing. I only hope no one else gets stuck in the same position, and if they do, I hope someone gets to them in time and that their life is spared like mine was that night. When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a boating trip out of Melbourne's western Port Bay. I remember being at the helm with my father, steering the little boat over the waves, and then the next thing we knew, my big brother was shouting that water was coming in. And it all happened so fast. Mom and Dad were shouting for us to stay together, and then suddenly, the boat tipped over, and we were in the water. We later found out that the bottom of our boat had been almost completely rotten, and that its owners had been extremely and willfully negligent in renting it to us, and we had no choice but to start swimming. Since it was late in the evening, no one had seen us go down, so it was up to us to rescue ourselves. I was a reasonably good swimmer, and we all had life jackets on, but it was still around 2 miles back to shore, so land looked like it was a long, long way away. Darkness fell as we were swimming, but my dad started to struggle and my big brother swam back to try and help him. My mom and I stuck together and kept going, but we soon lost sight of my father and brother. Seagulls cried out above me, and I kept imagining that they were warning me of an attack from sharks that were no doubt swimming in the waters around us. I could see land, but it didn't seem to get any closer. Finally, after more than 3 hours in that water, I felt the sandy bottom against my feet. I'd reached the mud flats of what I believed was the mainland, but my mom, dad, and brother were nowhere to be seen. I was weak, cold, and exhausted. I dragged myself through the mud, which at some points was almost up to my waist, and this was even more terrifying than the swimming. The mud kept on sucking me down, and I was terrified that I'd sink and be suffocated. My muscles ached, my lungs burned, and I felt like I was about to pass out at points. But at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, that it was essentially down to me and me alone to get help from my family. The clock was ticking in my head, and I needed to get my family the help they badly needed. When I finally made it ashore, I realized that I was on French Island, an island with an old, disused prison on it that has only about 50 people on it. I ran through the bushland, using up the last reserves of my energy, it felt like, and feeling thorns scratching against my legs and arms. I ran for a long time, too, stopping every so often to catch my breath before continuing through the bush. Finally, I found a house, and after banging on the door, someone opened it and I told them what had happened. I just remember crying and crying as they tried to comfort me, and how I begged them to help find my family. They told me everything was going to be okay, and that they'd contacted the Victoria Coast Guard. I appreciate that they were just trying to console me, but I knew they were wrong. The next morning, the bodies of my mom, dad, and older brother were recovered from the water off the coast of Fairhaven, and words can't express how devastated I was, and I was filled with this overwhelming survivor's guilt, thinking that I should be the one dead. And for 5 long years, I was a wreck, and I think I might be dead from drink and drugs if it wasn't for the birth of my first kid. And for a long, long time, I avoided any kind of large body of water, which included swimming pools, before my therapist suggested that I undertake some exposure therapy. This would involve brief trips to a local pool, but at first, my anxiety was so bad that even if my head was above the water, I just couldn't breathe. I tried for 4 months, but nothing worked until a local swim coach heard my story and offered some help. And then over the next year or so, the therapy started to chip away at my fear until, finally, I was able to look at the sea without feeling like I was about to have a panic attack. My proudest moment has been taking part in a charity swim across the Rip, which is an infamously rough stretch of water. We helped raise money for a domestic violence charity here in Australia, which is a cause very close to my heart for reasons that could well make for another true scary story. It might have taken me 20 years, but I no longer let my fear control me. I now understand that what happened wasn't my fault, but the irony of needing water to heal the very trauma that it created has never been lost on me.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
Hey y'all, my name is Troy, and I live with my wife and daughter in the gently neighborhood of New Orleans. Both me and my wife are Creole, and we're really proud of that. We have a rich and diverse heritage that we can both trace back for generations. When he was born, both were raised in New Orleans. It's our home, and neither of us would rather live anywhere else in the world. But although the city is nicknamed the Big Easy, living here has been anything but, from the heat and humidity to the gators and hurricanes. I think the sense of community down here has been forged out of suffering. And back in 2005, when we were hit by Hurricane Katrina, boy, did we suffer. So back in 2005, my family was living in this sturdy red brick 2-story here in Gently. I guess it's my fault that we went through what we did, because even after we got the hurricane warnings, I decided to keep us there. I mean, we had it for at least 4 or 5 years that time and never once had it flooded before. No matter how crazy the storms got. On top of that, the roof had almost an inch of waterproof plywood underneath it, and I laid all the shingle with my own 2 hands. I was proud of my work, to put a lot of time into it. Maybe it was my pride getting in the way, but I reckon we'd be alright. And at first, we were alright. My wife and I figured it was just another regular old hurricane, if you can call them that. But then we got the news that the levees had broken. And only then did we realize just what we were in for. The water came in fast, real fast. It flowed down the street we lived on like a river and leaked into our house wherever it could. I've grabbed all kinds of things we didn't want to lose from the ground floor and then headed upstairs to safety. Somehow, I got it into my head that they would just stop there. But I remember how scared my wife got as the water started climbing up the stairs step by step. We watched them disappear one by one until not long after, it was soaking into the carpet right there on the 2nd floor. The house had never flooded before, not even once. And then there we were feeling like we had no more than an hour before the entire place would be underwater. Our daughter was really young at the time, only just out of diapers. She can imagine how scared we were and how her crying made everything so much tenser. That's when all the power went out. Me and my wife saw this big flash of light outside, along with hearing these scary sounding sparks from outside, but it wasn't lightning. It was from the transformer down the block as it shorted out and gave up. After that, we were in darkness. I was hauling as many of my valuables and essentials as I could into the attic of her house, while my wife tried to keep the baby calm. She was hushing her, singing her little songs, but the baby was wailing something fierce. She knew something was badly wrong, and she wasn't too proud to show it. But the tide was up to our waist on the 2nd floor. We were all really starting to panic, but suddenly, it just sort of stopped. We weren't sure it had at first. I just figured it hadn't slowed down but was still rising. But sure enough, it had. I swear I could have danced for joy. Sure, almost the whole house was ruined, but as long as the water stayed just there, we wouldn't drown. And to me, that was something worth celebrating. It was about midnight when this water stopped rising and we were in total darkness, only able to see by flashlight. Our bedroom had a balcony on it, so I headed out there to get a look at the street outside. It was like a river out there, just all this rushing water flowing down the streets, and it was filthy. They had this oily black layer on the surface and trash was everywhere. All kinds of things floated past me. Anything that could float out of people's houses was just bobbing on the surface. It was a vision of utter destruction. But I'll never forget the noises coming from other people's houses. There were all these banging sounds coming from the people's roofs. What they were trying to break out of their attics was haunting, like all these houses had been turned into conference, and the people inside had been buried alive. Just this horrible boom, boom, boom that echoed all around our neighborhood, and you couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from. The water seemed to create these echoes or something, sending that sounds every which way until it seemed like the entire city was all playing drums at the same time. I'll never forget what that sounded like. I told my wife to take the kids up into the attic and try to get some sleep, but I'm not sure if she slept a wink that night. Around noon the next day, a boat full of guys wearing uniforms of some kind came along and hitched themselves to our back balcony railing. I thought we were saved and that everything after that would be okay. They drove the boat to a nearby overpass where they'd already ferried about half the neighborhood. I mean, there were about 200 or 300 scared, exhausted people already there, just waiting around to be told what to do next. But once we got there, we realized how bad the situation was. Nobody had no food with them, no water or bedding either. But we all just guessed that someone would come along with the supplies we needed. There was no way the government was just going to leave us there to die, right? Makes me angry just writing that, knowing what I do now. But they did. They just left us there to rot. Like they straight up forgotten about us. And that's when things started to get worse. I mean, really, really bad. After one night up, when the overpass, the sense of community started to come apart pretty quickly. Once people got into their heads that we had just been abandoned, it got tribal and brutal. Even people were going around taking food or money from those who wouldn't defend themselves properly. Those folks had no shame, didn't even bother to cover their faces or nothing like common bandits. They just felt entitled to other people's stuff. Not a hint of guilt about them. With little food or water, the group was all gone by the second night. And the next morning, people started trying to escape the overpass on whatever was floating by. I'm talking wheelbarrows, those little plastic swimming pools, anything that came by that looked like it might take them somewhere away from the overpass. People were getting really desperate by that point, and people were getting mean. Luckily, I had the foresight to keep my cell phone dry and charged. So the whole time we'd been up on that overpass, I'd been keeping in touch with a cousin of mine who lived uptown. He hadn't had any flooding at all, still had running water, still had power in the works. The only trouble was that the water was really deep at the end of the overpass. My wife wasn't a strong swimmer, and forget about the baby. So swimming was totally out of the question. We were trapped up there, stuck on that overpass, as the group we were with became more and more fractured, aggressive, and paranoid of each other. These mean folks were accusing people of hiding food or water. Fights was breaking now. Kids were crying. It was just awful. The third morning we were up there, something terrible happened. Some kid is messing around in the overpass railing, and I'm watching, wondering where the kid's parents are to stop them from doing something so dumb. And then the kid just slips. People screamed and ran to the edge, and so to die, there must have been a 50 or 60 foot drop into the water. I mean, it was a long way. We were expecting this kid to resurface so we could tell him where to swim, but no one comes up. He just disappeared under the water, and not a soul did anything to try and help. Only realized later that the water wasn't even all that deep, and the speed the kid fell, he would have smashed into the concrete under the water, maybe even head first from the way he fell. We watched the kid die that morning, and people were so hungry, thirsty, and tired that they almost acted like it didn't mean a thing. It was then that I decided that I had to get my family out of there before things got worse. And that's when I had an idea. You see, there was this guy on the other side of the overpass from us that had been sleeping on this inflatable pool lounger thing. The bandits in the group had tried to take it off of him at one point, and he had fought them off something fierce. But I figured if I'd asked him real nice and told him about my baby, he might just give it to me so we could get out of there. I walked across the group to him, and he gives me this look like, leave me alone. But I started explaining about my kid, how she hadn't had any food or water and God knows how long, and that if she didn't get some soon, she might die. It looks like he doesn't believe me until I point across the overpass to where they were sitting. Then the look on his face just softens, and he gives me that pool lounger without a word, just straight up gives it to me. So as discreetly as I can, as not let the bandits see us leaving, I take my family down to the water's edge and put them on the pool lounger, start wading out. Before long, I'm up to my neck in the filthy floodwater. My wife and kid are whimpering and crying, wanting to go back to the overpass because they were so scared, but I told them that wasn't happening. There was going to be a real bad scene up there, and I wasn't going to be around when it imploded. After about 2 or 3 hours of pushing that pool lounger in the direction of uptown, I'm exhausted, and our pace had slowed down a whole lot. All of a sudden, I feel the lounger snag on something in the water. Now you got to appreciate that because it was so dirty and oily, neither I nor my wife could see what it was. Like I said, I was incredibly tired, but I asked my wife to try and move it out of the way. But when she does, the thing rolls over in the water, and we actually see what it is. It was a dead guy. This old dude probably couldn't swim so well, and he looked absolutely horrified. His eyes were all milky white. His mouth was wide open and full of water, and space was all swollen and purple. I mean, he looked like a straight up monster. And my wife and kids started hollering up a storm on the lounger, begging me to get us out of there. I had to physically move this dead body out of the way of the lounger, grabbing onto the dead guy's arm and feeling it squish my hand as I dragged him away. The smell of the body was horrific. I was gagging and retching while my wife was hysterical on the lounger. I had to yell for her to calm down, screaming at her to get her head straight and never yell. And my wife, and I was just terrified she'd have a panic attack or something and fall off the lounge with our baby in her arms. But she does for the sake of our baby. She starts breathing right. In about an hour or so, the water starts shrinking a little until we could finally get evacuated out to a FEMA camp out in North Carolina. That was real nice to us, so good for so long. But what are we paying taxes for? Where we lived in Gently, there were all sorts of folks living in there. Black folks, white folks, land folks. And we all got abandoned just like everybody else did. I just hope that we learned enough from that whole horrible experience to be able to deal with it better next time. Something like that happens, and I pray that we do, because I'm not sure New Orleans could survive something like that again. As much as I love the place, Katrina showed me something. The community is fragile, and it doesn't take much for it to unravel.
The storm. On the morning of my first day working on a cruise ship, the excitement that had been building inside me for weeks reached its peak. I could hardly contain my enthusiasm as I made my way to the ship, my heart pounding with anticipation. The sight of the vast, sparkling ocean stretched out before me was like a dream come true, and I felt a sense of awe at the sheer grandeur of it all. I had worked tirelessly to get to this point, overcoming countless challenges and obstacles along the way, but now, as I stepped aboard the ship and took my surroundings, I knew that all that hard work had been worth it. The feeling of accomplishment was indescribable, and I felt a surge of pride at having achieved my lifelong dream. My love for water was something that I had developed purely on my own. None of my family members had ever worked in the maritime industry, and my grandpa even had a water phobia. However, I was different. I had always been fascinated with water. Watching documentaries and listening to people's stories about their experiences on the open sea only fueled my desire to explore the vast blue waters myself. As I stepped onto the ship, the salty scent of the ocean filled my nostrils, and the sounds of the waves crashing against the hull was music to my ears. However, I started feeling seasickness as the ship went deeper into the water. It was probably because of the tuna sandwiches I ate before coming on board. Still, it wasn't that bad, and I knew it would go away after a while. Time passed quickly on the ship, and while not everyone was friendly, I managed to make a few friends who shared my love for water. On the 5th day, around 2 a.m., I was working in the bar area when the announcement came. A massive storm was approaching, and we were instructed to take shelter in our rooms. Everyone started to act immediately as panic erupted, and my heart pounded as I rushed back to my cabin. Violent waves buffeted the ship, and the sound of the wind howling outside was deafening. I prayed that the ship would be strong enough to weather this storm. My heart was beating uncontrollably as I watched. The wind was cruel as it battered the ship, threatening to tear it apart. The waves were just as monstrous, rising and falling in a relentless assault that seemed capable of swallowing us whole. As the storm continued to rage on, the ship was tossed around like a mere toy in the hands of a giant. The sheer horror of this situation was palpable, as each one of us aboard trembled in fear. The sounds of things breaking and crashing could be heard with the storm's voice, a deafening roar that seemed to consume everything in its path. Amidst the chaos, there were faint screams of people coming from all sides, adding to the already terrifying atmosphere. As a staff member, I felt helpless and scared, unable to muster the courage to check on them. I know it was selfish of me, but I couldn't care less about others, knowing that my own life was at stake. I had been huddled in my room for hours, listening to the howling winds and crashing waves. Finally, the storm subsided, and I cautiously stepped out onto the hallway. The ship was in shambles. Broken furniture and personal belongings were strewn about, and the walls were scuffed and scratched. As I made my way to the upper deck, I saw that the damage was even worse outside. The deck was littered with debris, pieces of metal, shattered glass, people's vomit, and torn canvas. As I made my way through the wreckage, I noticed many injured people and a few casualties, including 3 of my new friends. It was a heart-wrenching sight that I'll never forget. After what felt like an eternity, help finally arrived, but it took more than an hour for the rescue team to reach us. They immediately started taking care of the injured and transporting them to a nearby coast. I remembered sitting in the corner of the deck when women and children were rescued first. It was a chaotic and emotional scene, with people crying and screaming for help. When it was finally my turn, everything felt still unreal, as if it was a nightmare. My heart was pounding so hard that it took me a moment to realize that I was being rescued. It almost felt like a miracle that I had survived the ordeal. Luckily, I was one of the ones who managed to escape with just a few bruises and scrapes, but the experience left me shaken to my core. As I sat on the rescue boat, I couldn't help but think about how lucky I was to be intact while many lost their loved ones. I'd always dreamed of working on a ship, but now I realized that life on the sea was not all sunsets and calm waters. We made our way back to shore, and I knew that my time on the ship was coming to an end. I had seen and experienced too much, and I knew that I could never go back to it. It was a bittersweet feeling. On the one hand, I was sad to leave behind my dream job and the friends I'd made. On the other hand, I was grateful to be alive. As I stood on the shore, watching the chaos unfold before me, ambulances rushed back and forth, sirens blaring. As they transported injured individuals to the nearest hospital, the once calm and inviting ocean now looked like a menacing force, unleashing its fury upon anyone who dared to enter its domain. At that moment, I realized that my life held far more value than any dream job ever could. I couldn't bear the thought of putting myself in harm's way just for the sake of a paycheck. Don't get me wrong, I still loved the water and all of its beauty, but the sight of the ocean's wrath instilled a sense of fear in me that couldn't be ignored.
In South Korea, national election days are made public holidays so that citizens get a chance to go out and vote. March 26th of 1991 was a holiday for that exact reason. And given that schools are closed on national holidays, a group of young South Korean schoolboys were out making the most of their day off of school. The 5 boys were from Daosa district of Daegu and attended the same elementary school, and although they varied in age from 9 years old to 13, they were all the very best of friends. They were 13-year-old Yoo Cha-won, 12-year-old Jo Ho-yeon, 11-year-old Kim Yong-yu, 10-year-old Park Chan-in, and 9-year-old Kim Jong-sik. On that particular day, the boys decided to spend the day searching for salamander eggs in the streams of Mount Woryong on the western outskirts of Daegu. A 6th child, 10-year-old Kim Tae-yong, left the group to go home and eat, having missed breakfast that morning. But the next day, the boy discovered that his parents seemed particularly interested in where he'd last seen his friends. The boy was honest and mentioned that they'd been hunting eggs at a certain section of stream, but the answer didn't seem to satisfy. And as much as his parents were trying to protect him from it, it slowly became apparent that something had happened to his friends, something very bad indeed. In fact, none of his 5 friends had returned home that day, and their disappearance sparked a case that would haunt the South Korean national consciousness for years. The story made national headlines. Entire news programs were dedicated to sharing information surrounding the boys' disappearance, and South Korean President Roh Tae-woo sent over 300,000 police and military troops to search for the boys. They searched reservoirs, irrigation waterways, bus terminals, and stations nationwide. The fact that the boys were looking for salamander eggs was soon disregarded, as rumor and conjecture replaced salamanders with frogs. Soon the boys were looking for frog eggs. Therefore, in the national consciousness, they became the Frog Boys. Many of the Frog Boys' parents even quit their jobs to search for their children full-time, with the area they disappeared, Mount Woryong, being intensively searched more than 500 times. A series of companies and civic groups made monetary donations totaling 42 million won, or $35,000, as a reward to those who found the boys. But in the years that followed, no one was ever able to lay claim to the reward. With a total lack of evidence or clues regarding the boys' whereabouts, Korean media outlets began to make grim speculations as to the boys' fate. Some journalists at Korea's Junang Daily News made incredibly spurious and irresponsible claims that the boys had been kidnapped by a mentally ill person, despite the fact that there was absolutely nothing to back this claim up. Police would receive hundreds of tips over the years that followed, but none would yield any significant results. The only truly intriguing tip was from a man who claimed to be responsible for the crime. This sick individual claimed to have abducted the children and was keeping them barely alive as prisoners in some unknown location. He chillingly declared that they were alive, but not well. Not much else is known about the fraudulent tipster, but he too was ruled out of the investigation as it became clear that he was only interested in conning the police and the boys' parents out of the 42 million won reward. It took 11 years for any developments in the case, but eventually, in September of 2002, a man searching for acorns in Mount Waryong came across a horrifying sight. In an anonymous phone call to emergency services, the man reported that he'd stumbled across the bodies of 5 dead and decaying children. When police showed up to close off the crime scene, it was confirmed shortly after that the bodies belonged to those 5 missing schoolboys that had gone missing all those years ago. At first, investigators speculated that the boys had gotten lost before dying of hypothermia during the night. But the boys' parents completely rejected the idea, claiming their boys knew the area well enough to find their way home under any circumstances. They demanded a full inquiry into their sons' deaths, with particular focus on why some of the boys' clothes seemed to have been tied into knots. What's more, the boys were just a few minutes' walk from a village they knew well, so to their parents, it was clear that some kind of foul play was at work. Lo and behold, forensic experts later found the skulls of 3 of the boys had been fractured by blunt force trauma, possibly inflicted by a small metal tool. This led homicide detectives to conclude that they had been murdered by someone who, according to them, had flown into a rage. But what could have the boys done to incur such wrath? Multiple theories have cropped up over the years, some more plausible than others. One of the more likely explanations is that the boys were killed by older bullies who, upon realizing just what they'd done, fled the area and never spoke of it again. There was also a military firing range just a mile or so away from where the bodies were found, suggesting they could have possibly been hit by a stray round. However, given that the day they vanished was a national holiday, it seems unlikely that any kind of formal shooting practice would have taken place that day. Other more terrifying theories include the idea that the boys had been killed by a group of local lepers, who then extracted their livers under the assumption that consuming them would cure or otherwise alleviate the symptoms of their crippling disease. We can speculate all we want, but the fact remains that the cause of death remains a complete mystery, making the case of the murdered frog boys one of the most notorious cold cases in South Korean history. We can only hope that sometime soon, developments in forensic and other investigative technologies reaches a point where we can finally deliver justice to the monster who killed those boys, then covered it up.